This edition of MacVoices is sponsored by Linode, your solution when you need a virtual server in the cloud. Use the code MacVoices2019 to take $20 off your first purchase at linode.com/MacVoices. Hi, I'm Chuck Joyner, and this is a MacVoices briefing on starting a new podcast. Folks, if you follow me on social media or you subscribe to the MacVoices Dispatch, you know that a few months ago I started a new show, a Star Trek themed show called TrekFavorites. And I thought this would be a good time to walk through the process of starting a new podcast in today's world, simply because MacVoices was created so long ago at a time when we were hand-coding our own RSS feeds and figuring things out. Now, there's so many different services out there that can make it a whole lot easier. There's still a lot to do, but it can be so much easier than it was back then. And that means that some of my choices this time around are quite a bit different than the choices I made then. So let's dig in. First off, the first thing you have to do is figure out the theme for your show. Now that would sound obvious, right? But I hear a lot of people, say, I'd like to start a podcast. Well, what do you want to do? What do you want to talk about? Well, I don't know, but I want to start a podcast. And that's great. But you still have to have an idea of where you want to go, because at the end of the day, sometime you're going to get tired. It just happens. And you better have something that you're talking about or focusing on that you really enjoy, or that can provide you with a whole lot of content, or both. If you do get started, I would suggest that you decide on at least 5 different show topics to get started. That way, as you get your show up and running, you can focus on a lot of the other things that go with starting a show and won't have to be stressing over, okay, what am I going to talk about for my next show? So again, it seems simple, but it is something to think about. Naming your podcast. Again, this seems like a no-brainer and pretty simple, but there are a number of considerations that you need to take before you put a name to your show. Not the least of which is creating an identity. That's what you want to do here. You want to create something that people know and understand and will associate with you and your topic. So think about the fact that your show needs to be something that can easily pop up in a Google search. So it's much better if it's somewhat unique or a little bit different and not terribly generic. You also are going to want to make sure that you can get the domain name for that show title, or at least something close to it that makes sense, and all the social media presences that go along with having a podcast in today's world. And that means Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, any other social media that you happen to be on. The odds are that you're going to probably want to establish your identity on those services, and to do so, you want to make it easy to find, and that means being able to get the name. So don't overlook those items. Put those on your checklist of things to do before you finalize the name of your podcast. The format of your podcast. This, again, would seem to be something easy and obvious because you obviously have something in mind if you're thinking about it. But think about whether you're going to go solo and just do a show by yourself about whatever you're talking about with a dedicated partner or partners, or whether you're going to be a host and have guests on your show like MacVoices. Each one of those options has advantages and disadvantages. If you're solo, you can do it when it's convenient for you. You can do it in a way that suits you, and you don't have to rely on anyone else. If you're doing it with a partner, then obviously you have a partnership, and you don't want to let the other person down, but it's also going to complicate scheduling and availability. And if you are a host and inviting guests, that too seems like a really good idea. But I can tell you from experience that one of the toughest things about producing MacVoices is just the scheduling of guests, not the availability of people to talk to about things that you want to talk about, but just getting them scheduled within your schedule and theirs. Finally, on this point, if you are podcasting with a partner or a group of people, make sure that you decide early on, and please put it in writing in an email that everybody agrees to, who owns what about the podcast. The name, the domain, the logo, all of those things. Treat it like a business, because if it goes south on you, you don't want to be fighting about those things after the fact. I've seen it happen way too many times, and while you might not necessarily want to take the time and expense to draw up a legal document, at least if you can have something like that, it does make the process easier because you will have agreed upon it. Your logo and artwork. Even though you're producing most likely an audio podcast, you still have to have a visual presence. iTunes, your website, your social media presences, all of those, you want something that can be visually identified with your show. I personally prefer something that is basic for a number of reasons, not the least of which is just readability at all kind of sizes. Because don't forget, all of those items I just mentioned are going to be viewed on screens from your 27-inch iMac the whole way down to the currently smallest iPhone. And that's also one of the challenges here, that when you go to prepare that artwork, every single outlet seems to demand a different size and different format. So that means, in my opinion, you're going to want to work in vectors. Pixels are great, and a lot of people are more comfortable with pixels, but pixels do strange things when you try to scale them. Vectors don't do as strange of things, and they are a lot easier to work with. I create all of my artwork in Affinity Designer. That means that I can scale it. I can do whatever I want with it for whatever size is necessary for whatever outlet, and it will still look good. But again, think about the simplicity because of the way that things are formatted, and we'll get into this a little bit later. But everybody formats things differently. Everybody requires different sizes, different aspect ratios, and so take a little bit of time, make your image a whole lot easier to deal with if you're working in vectors. When I created the logo for TrekFavorites, I wanted something that honored the Star Trek tradition, but I didn't want to rip off any of the Star Trek imagery. So what I did was I found some public domain and shareware fonts that are similar to the original Star Trek series and used those to create a simple TrekFavorites logo. I used a background star field, which now I kind of regret for some of the reasons I'm telling you about, instead of just a black star field, or just a black background, and I may change that going forward because of the scalability and some of the challenges associated with that. But it's basic, it gets this point across. My show name is obvious, that if we're talking Star Trek and we're talking about favorite shows. So those are some tips on putting together the logos and the artwork. But there are plenty of things out there, and you can find custom logos, and you can design custom logos, or you can pay someone to do custom logos. Nothing wrong with that. But make sure that it's something that will scale and is easily identifiable for your show. Linode.com/MacVoices is where you want to go if you need a virtual hosted cloud server. Why is Linode so great? Because that's what Linode specializes in. They feature native SSD storage, a 40 gigabit network, and industry-leading processors so that your server is fast fast. Because you pay for only what you use, with hourly billing across all plans and add-on services. No extra charges for data transfer, no hidden fees or nasty surprises at the end of the month. Because Linode has a new cloud manager with an improved user interface, so deploying your server or servers is easier than ever. Because Linode has data centers around the world, including one just launched in Toronto and one opening soon in Mumbai. So if location matters, Linode has it covered. Because they have a large documentation library to help you get started and help you make the most of your server. Because Linode has 24/7 live customer support, so if you get stuck or have issues, help is just a phone call away. Because Linode has a ton of add-ons, so that you can customize your server with exactly what you want and what you need. Backups, blocks, node balancers, load balancers, and much more. So what do you need to take advantage of all this? Visit linode.com/MacVoices to get set up and to get $20 credit towards your first server. Again, linode.com/MacVoices gets you $20 off your first server. Check it out now and be up and running in minutes. Thanks to Linode for their support of MacVoices. Your show's theme music. Every podcast needs theme music. Yeah, you can do it without theme music, but that helps create your identity, and that's sort of the point of this discussion. There are plenty of options out there for music, from free the whole way up to very, very custom done expensive. I would encourage you to not use necessarily what Apple gives you in GarageBand as your theme music, simply because other people are doing the same thing, and it's quite possible that the music you select and becomes associated with your show will show up on someone else's production that might be completely different, a completely different subject matter, maybe even antithetical to what you are doing. So I would encourage you to go and buy some royalty-free music or licensed music. When I created TrekFavorites, I went to Soundstripe after having interviewed them at NAB last year. I was very impressed with the idea of their service, the way they support independent artists, and their licensing. And so for a pretty nominal fee, I was able to pick a piece of music that I really liked that seemed to kind of fit the pace of TrekFavorites and is much, much less likely to appear in anyone else's production. Not impossible. So you're not buying necessarily exclusive rights. You can do that. It's just going to cost you a lot of money. But buy something that maybe other people aren't going to use and that fits the style of your show. Hosting your podcast. This is probably one of the most important decisions you're going to make, because what you don't want to do is start your podcast and then 6 months in discover that, gee, I really should have gone with a different host because my host doesn't do A, B, C, or D that I really want them to do. So go in with eyes wide open and select a podcast host that gives you everything that you want. I've picked Libsyn for TrekFavorites because Libsyn is also where I host MacVoices. But I do that a little bit differently. Back when Libsyn started, it was not quite as fully featured, and I needed a place to put the audio files that wasn't going to cost me an arm and a leg if a whole lot of people downloaded them. Libsyn solved that problem, and since then they've grown, matured, added to their services, and now they will not only host your feed, but also create the RSS feeds for you. And in today's world, that's become a whole lot bigger thing, because Apple keeps changing the rules of their RSS feeds, and they are the big dog in the podcast discovery space. And the last thing I want to do is be tweaking around with my RSS feed and trying to figure it out if I don't have to, especially with a brand new show. So I signed up with Libsyn, and everything is hosted there and they create my RSS feeds that go out to iTunes, to all the other RSS readers, all the other distribution points for podcasts. So I would encourage you to check out Libsyn or somebody like them, simply because their business is creating and hosting and keeping your feeds up and available to everyone. And it's one less thing you have to do, one more piece of time that you can save and dedicate to your show. Your podcast's website. There are three basic choices for your podcast's website. The first is for you to build your own dedicated website. The second is to use one of those pre-prepared, pre-canned websites that Libsyn or some of the other podcast hosts provide for you. And nothing wrong with those. The third is to have no website at all. And that really doesn't feel like much of a choice, simply because then you have no presence on the web that you can point people to other than a social media presence, which is hosted by someone else. The canned websites are great, and when I say canned, there's nothing wrong with them. It's just that your website, outside of creating your logo and doing that, is going to look like any other website hosted on that service. It's a great way to get started, but it's probably not the best way maybe to really create that identity, especially if you're thinking about being in this for the long term. So I believe in a dedicated website. The MacVoices website is done in WordPress, and WordPress is great, but you still have to find a host for it. You have to maintain it. You have security concerns, and some of you that have been around with me for a while know that I've gone through website hacks and problems of that nature. That's why I decided to take TrekFavorites onto Squarespace. Squarespace handles all of that for you. There's really nothing that you really want or need that you can't do with Squarespace. Yeah, you are limited to some of their templates, but their templates are extremely flexible. And if you really, really, really have to have one particular feature that is not there, you can probably hire somebody to do custom coding, but that really is not necessary. So Squarespace is where you'll find TrekFavorites, and I've really enjoyed it. It's very affordable, very easy to use, very short learning curve, and it gives me a place where I can have that dedicated presence I'm looking for. Your podcast's social media presences. We talked a little bit about this in the graphics and logo area, but I want to reiterate that having presences on the different social media sites is, in my opinion, a good thing. Now look, we're not going to have the Facebook discussion about whether you should be there or whether it's good or evil or any of that. The simple fact is that a lot of people are on Facebook, just like a lot of people are on Twitter. And if you want to build an audience and attract an audience and engage with an audience, you're going to have to go where the people are. So I think that all of those presences are really, really important. For MacVoices, I have a page and a group. For TrekFavorites, I decided on just a page, at least for now, as I build my audience. Both are very easy to create. They're going to require some moderation in the case of a group, and you have some choices to make there that you can find a lot of articles about how to do it and the pros and cons. But I would definitely encourage you to have a Facebook presence. The same with Twitter. Depending on exactly what your audience is, Twitter's a place where you can help get the word out and have people see it. Instagram has been another essential one. I was not able to get the TrekFavorites identity on Instagram. Not quite sure why, but I couldn't. So I'm posting things there under just my identity, which is also where I post MacVoices things. So that mixes it up a little bit. And it kind of brings up another point, that you can have your own personal presences on these services as well and publish and produce and promote your podcast there. Nothing wrong with that, but I find it very useful to have a dedicated presence for both shows on the social media sites so that folks that really don't care about one show or the other or my personal life can go and just get the information on those shows. Other considerations. My intent was to have TrekFavorites be an audio-only show, but I've been doing MacVoices audio and video for a long time. My workflows are pretty well established and pretty easy to do for me. And I still think that there's a huge amount of value in having the audience potentially see the interaction between the guests, me, and the topics that we're covering. It also adds some additional dimensions to it from the standpoint of being able to do screenshots of websites or items or whatever it is that you want to present visually. I record with Zoom. I edit in Final Cut, and I do a significant amount of editing to both shows simply because that's the way that I like it. That's the kind of show I want to produce. Zoom will let you do a very simple side-by-side or multi-panel feed with no editing at all, unless you want to add a bumper or an intro or an outro. And I would encourage you to do that, again, to help build that brand. For TrekFavorites, I wanted something simple, but I wanted something Star Trek-like. So I was able to find a plugin that would generate a moving star field similar to the original Star Trek series. I took some of those public domain fonts that I mentioned. I rebuilt the TrekFavorites logo inside Final Cut and added the music from Soundstripe, and I had my intros and my outros. TrekFavorites. What are yours? If you're going to do video, don't overlook YouTube. That's probably where you're going to want to host your video. And again, it's where a lot of people go to consume content. And we're right back to that discussion of needing to go where the audience is instead of trying to pull the audience to maybe just strictly your site. That list is not intended to be comprehensive. There are plenty of other lists out there, but I haven't seen anything that actually walks you through some of these things and explains why. So hopefully this will help you if you decide to start producing your own podcast. If you have questions or comments or want some clarification on something, drop me an email, chuck@MacVoices. And of course, you can connect with me on Facebook and Twitter. And I would love to hear from you. I'd love to hear what your ideas are for your next project. This has been a MacVoices briefing on starting your own podcast. I'm Chuck Joyner. Thanks for watching. Visit MacVoices.com for show notes and to connect with Chuck on social media. Get involved in our Facebook group or like our Facebook page, and get more out of your Apple tech with MacVoices Magazine, free on Flipboard and on the web. And if you find value in it all, consider supporting us through either our Patreon campaign at patreon.com/MacVoices or by making a one-time donation via the PayPal link on our front page and in the show notes of each episode. You will join these fine people who help bring you MacVoices. Advertising handled by Backbeat Media at backbeatmedia.com. Bandwidth provided by CacheFly at cachefly.com.